I'm really happy that we can introduce to you Dr. James Allan. James Allan is providing an African conservation perspective. He grew up and worked in conservation in Kenya and pursued his PhD in Australia. So we also have a slight Australian flavor, perhaps, in his work. And we know him at the University of Amsterdam because he worked with us doing his postdoc at the University of Amsterdam. And James is a spatial ecologist, and his research has focused and especially understanding what this means for wildlife and conservation action, and finishing wilderness areas, the true areas barely influenced by humans, areas in collaboratives. And from this work, he and his colleagues identified global priorities for the conservation attention. So I'm really pleased, again, James, that you are with us and presenting your work on the mapping of global conservation priorities, and I'm very curious what you think about this link with post-growth and alternative economies. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Kenneth. It's really exciting to be here, and I've enjoyed the talks this morning very much. A lot of very interesting work happening in this space. I'll get straight into the meat of this. Can you see my slides now, Kenneth? They're up? Brilliant. All right. Well, I don't need to run through much of this. Kenneth covered that very well just now. Since finishing my postdoc at the University of Amsterdam, I've moved back to Kenya, and I run a carbon credit business. And the irony of being a capitalist at a post-growth economic is not lost on me. Just a quick background of my research history in a nutshell. On the left of your screen, you've got one pillar, which is mapping the world's wilderness areas. And this was my PhD work. And the main finding of that is that we lost 3 million square kilometers of wilderness in just 16 years. And that's 10% of the remaining wilderness. And so if you look at that little map of the world there, you'll see that the clear bit is all that's left. And that red line is how it's slowly being destroyed by people. We also did some work on the policy options to protect wilderness. Now, on the other side of the screen, you've got my other research pillar, which is mapping humanity's physical footprint on planet Earth and understanding what that means for World Heritage Sites, protected areas, and biodiversity. And so some of the key things we found was that a third of land that is supposed to be protected is actually human dominated. It's been built on, it's been farmed, yet governments are reporting that in their progress towards their international targets and things. So that was one of the big findings there. Now, in the last year in my postdocs, I've been working more on conservation prioritization. So identifying the global priorities for conservation action. And that brings today's talk, where I'm trying to answer 3 fairly fundamental questions for conservation biology. And the first is how to conserve to save biodiversity, to stop extinctions. Where is it located? Converted to human uses or destroyed, and which in those spaces. And the reason these questions interest me is because they're essentially the answers to the main goals and aims of the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity, where all international targets for biodiversity are set through. So if we can map out and answer those questions, we can then actually implement their vision. Now, this is quite because this year governments are going to adopt a new strategic plan for biodiversity through the UN, which will define how conservation happens for the next decade. And discussions about what targets and goals this should contain are still ongoing. And hopefully it's signed later this year, although COVID keeps pushing it back. But it gives us a chance to influence it. Now, what we currently know is that the current targets from the last decade are woefully inadequate for achieving the goal of safeguarding biodiversity. So what I mean by that is we could take this target here. There's a lot on this slide. So all you need to know is that 17% of land was meant to be protected. And that's an inadequate target, because if we did that and the rest of the land was converted to human uses, we would still have an extinction crisis on our hands. This target isn't big enough to solve the problem. And there's a lot that's been written in that space. Another example of an inadequate target is target 5, which was Aichi target 5, which is meant to deal with habitat loss, where countries were meant to halve the rate of loss by 2020. Now that's a rate of change. We could halve that, but we're still going to lose huge amounts and have extinctions. So none of these actually get towards what is the end state that we need to actually solve this problem. And so with this new Convention on Biological Diversity strategic plan, we have a unique opportunity to influence this, every decade. So a lot of scientists are having their say at the moment and trying to be heard. Now, this has led to a range of estimates for how big a conservation target should be, of how much land is protected. And they range from anywhere from 1/4 of the planet to 3/4 of the planet. All these different groups pitching their own agenda, fight, they hate each other. It's basically created a big mess for policymakers. How do they sift through this and work out what really needs to be done? So that's one problem. The other problem is there's actually a lack of credible scientific evidence for the target setting discussions. And what I mean by this is these are 2 really interesting studies I've put on the page here by very high profile scientists, but they plucked a number 50% out of thin air and decided that's the number we need to protect, and then mapped out how to do that. Now, we have no idea if that's too much or too little. So I do question some of these approaches. So during my postdocs, decided to set out and think, right, let's identify what is the minimum area necessary to achieve the goals of conservation. And we sort of looked at that from 3 pillars. We need to prevent extinction, we need to halt species decline, and we want to save habitat. So capturing the range of biodiversity values out there as much as possible. And so to go about actually doing something like this, we said, well, where do we start? So this map you're looking at right now is the current protected area estate. And it's already formally protected by governments. And there's good evidence to suggest that biodiversity is doing better in these places than outside. So we may as well hold what we've got. It seems like a pretty logical starting place to map out these needs. Another spatial representation of important biodiversity areas are KBAs, key biodiversity areas that have been mapped out by BirdLife International. They have a whole different aim and set of criteria to protected areas. These focus on places that make a disproportionately large contribution to conservation. For example, a key migratory stopover site, a key breeding site. Just really important areas. And they're quite scientifically credible too. There's good criteria for picking them. And they're a bottom-up approach as well, where governments and local organizations can identify them rather than a top-down global approach. And then another spatial configuration of important areas is the wilderness mapping, which sort of is great science done, particularly a paper that showed that species living in wilderness areas are half as likely to go extinct compared to ones living outside them. So again, these places are crucially important for, keeping them intact is crucially important for stopping the extinction crisis. So we figure, right, let's bring all these different things together. And this is what we have already. The Venn diagram on the left shows how much overlap there is between them. I think a key takeaway from that is there isn't much overlap. So if you actually push any individual conservation agenda, and each sort of big conservation organization will be behind one of these 3 approaches, but rarely all, you'd be missing a lot of stuff. So you need to look at it. But the question here is this enough already to protect everything? So what we did is what's called a gap analysis, where we took 35,000 species distributions and overlapped them with that map and basically asked the question, is enough of their range conserved in those areas for them to survive? And what we found is that half of them, the answer is no. Half of that 35,000 species do not have enough range in there to survive. So we're going to need additional conservation areas to stop them going extinct in the future. And on this graph, all I think we should focus on here is the orange bars. And that just shows the percent of species that meet their coverage targets. And you can see that for some taxa, such as birds or mammals, we're actually doing quite well. 2/3 to 3/4 of them are well enough conserved already in those areas. But for others like freshwater life, amphibians, we're actually quite a long way behind on that. So our biases are quite apparent here in conservation. Now, to work out where we needed to go in addition to our current map to protect these species, we carried out a conservation prioritization. I don't want to go into the methods of this. It's mathematical, but we basically answered the question, let's maximize coverage of species until we have enough of each one conserved while minimizing the impact on people. And we did that by avoiding places with a lot of people and infrastructure, using this map on the right of your screen, the human footprint. And so the output of this exercise is this map here. And all these green areas is the optimum solution, so the most cost-effective way in terms of minimizing land to make sure every species that we manage to use in this analysis is protected well enough. And so if we bring this all together, we have our estimate of what the minimum land area is that requires conservation to avoid extinctions. And so we're looking at about 44% of Earth's surface there. And it's quite, that sounds like quite a lot, but if you think about it, a lot of that's already protected. The green areas are actually small. The size of the Venn diagram circles shows that in comparison to what's already protected. So it isn't that ambitious. But the key thing is to think about what we're doing in these places. So no one's suggesting lock them all up, turn them into one big protected area. 44% of Earth like that would never happen, and it would be pretty terrible. So we need to think about our different actions. And I think this is where post-growth also comes into this whole topic, because I think one thing I'd like people to think about today is where degrowth or post-growth economies occur and where the benefits of that occur. So your whole global economy could, decrease, but it's where that happens locally that will define whether things go extinct or not. We'll come more on that at the end. So in some places, we just need landscape scale stuff. Don't allow logging in there. Just don't develop it. Just leave it alone. But you can do non-extractive things. In other areas, we will need strict protection. And what this depends on is the level of risk. If a place is really at risk right now, then we need to get there and act. If it's not at risk, we can just leave it alone. It's safe. It's sort of de facto protected. And so to do this, we tried to model risk of habitat conversion in the future within these important conservation areas. The Yasser Institute in Austria has these fantastic projections of future land use. You can see this little map at the bottom left of your screen. This is what they look like. So that's habitat conversion for 2030 that you're seeing there. And what they've done is they've modeled future land use change under several storylines, basically, or different potential futures. So we decided to look at two of these storylines. One is an optimistic future where we actually stayed below our 2-degree targets and met everything in the Paris Agreement and our biodiversity agreements. And the other scenario is more of a status quo, regional rivalries, land use is not well regulated. It's basically the two. And so this is what the current situation looks like. On this map, the areas in gray were not identified as important. Any area in color is identified as important for conservation. It's that previous map that I showed you. And the darker the red is, the more likely it is to be converted by people in the next decade. So essentially the habitat would be destroyed. And what we can see is that an area larger than South Africa, that's 1.2 million kilometers is going to be converted, and that most of that is in Africa, which is really the front line of conservation. And that will be where the next wave of extinctions happens, sort of what Southeast Asia was over the last 20 years. Africa could be over the next 20 if we don't act right now. So if we then project further out and look at 2050, we're now looking at an area the size of Greenland being converted. The pattern is similar. Africa dominates, but India flags up, the east coast of the United States. It's not just a South problem, this. Brazil. So yeah, if we did go down this route and we don't do anything, there will be mass extinctions occurring across Africa. That's a given. But there is a measure of a sort of ray of hope in this. Now, these maps are small. I don't expect you to see the detail. What I'd like you to take away from this slide is the two maps on the left of screen show what would happen if we actually met all of our targets and stayed in a 2-degree future. And you'll see there is very little red on that map. We're talking 100,000 kilometers of land cleared versus on the right of the screen, under our current trajectory, several million kilometers being converted. So I think there's an encouraging story in there. And this modeling doesn't even account for the impact of protection on the ground. So on these sustainable future maps on the left, the red bits, we could go in and actually start putting protected areas in these places. That would sort of be a priority thing for the conservation movement. And in this case, I do mean strict protected areas, because we're talking about bulldozers going in and clearing this land. So it's a necessary action. In the rest of this map is where you think about community-based conservation, broad land use policy and human engagement. So we do need every tool in the toolbox. We've broken this down into countries. Each of these bars shows how much of a country needs to be conserved, and the red and the orange, how much of that important land is going to be converted. Just some things that jump out. On the left of the circle, you can see that the land area that needs to be conserved in the global north is actually higher than in the global south. But all of the current risk is in the global south. So the immediate action needs to occur there. It's also pretty apparent from this that there are huge inequities in this. The burden of conservation really lies on a few compared to others. And so financial mechanisms that balance that out, biodiversity has to be conserved where it's found. So having a flat target like conserve 17% of land is fairly silly. Each country has to do its bit based on what it can contribute to the solution. And so that's what this work kind of shows. The green arrow shows the Netherlands in there, I think. So just to bring that sort of full circle a little bit, basically this map, if we went out there and conserved all of it, we would meet these targets that I've got written down on the right from the previous decade's worth of Aichi targets. So essentially it's a spatial representation of those. And it can really define action towards achieving them moving forward. But with any big study like this, it's obviously riddled with holes and caveats and uncertainties. I'm sure in question time, you can rip me apart for it. Very open to that. But let's just think through some of the quick ones. I mean, can we achieve human energy and food needs outside of this 44%? I think those are really important questions to start answering, because if not, then it's a trade-off, and we'll have to accept extinctions to meet our own needs and make some very hard choices there. Is the other 56% condemned, and what do we do in it? I mean, things like pollution and fossil fuel emissions affect the whole planet. So what happens in that 56% is important, but in different ways, not necessarily the land use is important. And as I mentioned, of course, the different countries have their different burdens. And I think a financial mechanism there is, balancing those books is one of the most crucial challenges in conservation. So there's some really interesting studies sort of building off this. So this here is some work led by the Rights and Resources Initiative. And they took these maps and looked at how many people live in the areas. We found 1.8 billion people live in the important conservation areas that we've mapped. So yeah, the strategies for how we conserve and work with them is really going to have to be nuanced. It's going to be challenging. Read this report. It focuses a lot on the indigenous communities living in these areas and how they can be partners in this. And we actually tried to cost out whether hard conservation, like a protected area that evicts people and compensates them, versus the cost of engaging with the community, and weigh up the two financially. And obviously engaging with people came out quite a bit cheaper. So it's not only ethical, it's more cost effective for conservation. And other work building on this is, what does protecting this sort of, large percent of our planet mean for our global economies? And you may have some interesting insights here as a post-growth community, but Anthony Waldron's done some great modeling showing that if we increased the protected area estate up to 30% of the planet, that would actually benefit the economy. Economic output would be higher based on the amount of ecosystem services, tourism jobs, it's fairly complex stuff. I haven't got my head around it, but I think the findings are very interesting. The McKinsey company has done similar stuff, looking at it from a job creation and an ecosystem services point of view. And then also, Jocelyn and Emil, who are talking later on this afternoon in this symposium, have been doing some really interesting work trying to map out calculate a conservation basic income, and looking at the people living in these areas and what it would cost to use that as a sort of policy tool to conserve them. So yeah, looking forward to that talk later on. And so just in summary, we've answered some fairly fundamental questions for conservation. How much land do we need to protect? Where is it? And which bits do we need to act in now? And one thing I forgot to mention earlier is that 64 million Ks may sound big, but only 1.2 million of it is at risk of being lost in the next decade. So that's all we need to focus on right now. This work can inform targets, the way the UN is setting them for the next decade. I think there's some numbers in here that they should look at. And of course, what's the reality for people in the economy when we start implementing this? So I'm going to wrap up there. We've got a preprint out with this paper. It has more of the details, the methods, and yeah, I'd love some discussion right now. Usually I would say if anyone could identify the 3 species in the photos I've taken, I would buy them a beer or a coffee, but unfortunately we're not in person, so I can't. But thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, I'd love any questions or discussion. Go ahead, Marco.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I have one question that probably connects also to the previous talk by Iago. I was wondering to what extent and how in your mapping exercise did you take into consideration plurality of values, and how that plurality of values have informed the maps that you have constructed? Because in my understanding, just my understanding, you have mostly focused on what in the literature is called the inherent value of nature, so from a merely ecological standpoint. And so how do you engage also with the plurality of values? Like, do we need to include them in maps? Is it even possible to do so? Are there efforts in place that maybe I don't know about? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. I haven't read too much on plurality of values, and I don't think we went out of our way to look at that. Let me explain what we do again quickly in a way that might clarify that. So we looked at it purely from a point of, we have species, and we assume that that goal, that's captured in the CDP, is basically to meet that goal. Oh, sorry, my sound will come back. The internet must have dropped out.
Yeah, exactly. So I couldn't really hear what you said. I don't know if it was only me.
Can you hear me now?
Can you repeat it, because you are? I think your microphone is not functioning well at the moment, or at least the sound is not transferring well.
Okay. What I'm saying is we took a goal which is in the CBD, and that goal is stop extinction.
No.
So we make the assumption. Can't hear me, Kenneth?
I'm sorry, James, but there is something now. There is a glitch with your microphone, and we hear you only very softly.
I apologize. My internet must be coming in and out.
Yeah, that's strange. Happily.
Explain this. So, and there are plural views out there, but we just focus on this one goal, which is stopping extinction. And you need to give species enough habitat and space to live in. That can be mapped out. And there may be many different ways to think about how that can be done and how the benefits and interactions of biodiversity play out. But in the end, that is the fundamental goal that we're looking at in conservation. I don't know if that answers your question, Marco, or not. Really happy to talk more about it afterwards and hear some more detail about what you were thinking.
I suggest that our speakers also type their question in the chat, and that you can answer them afterwards as well, because 80% of your answer was lost. James, sorry to say that. Wow. So if your questions are, please type also your questions, and then you can react through the chat. But still, I would like to invite some other people to ask questions. Yuri, can you see who has a question still?
Kaelis has his hand raised still, and I believe that Iago had a question earlier as well.
Yeah. So perhaps Iago, if you want to start with your question.
Yes, thanks a lot, James, for a wonderful talk. I was wondering, I really like this map where you compare the outcomes with the SSP1 and the SSP3, which shows that, as you said, the development pathway matters. My question is about the SSP1. When I was preparing the paper in Conservation Letters, I had a discussion with the people in the Netherlands doing the scenarios for the ITBES, and they told me that SSP1 basically relies massively on carbon capture and storage technologies, etc., to stay within the planetary boundaries, especially regarding climate change and so on. So I was wondering whether you know a bit about the assumptions behind this SSP1 that is used by the EASA, if I understood correctly, in these maps that you presented, because I don't know much about it. My feeling is that it's the best option out of the many options that we have now regarding SSP, but it's still quite, it might be a bit unfeasible regarding technological efficiency, but I don't know. I don't know if you could say something about this, if you know a bit about this SSP.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Iago. I'm not that familiar with the assumptions and modeling under it. I've used it more as an off-the-shelf product. We got this paper back from review recently, and so I'm updating it by using a broader range of different SSP scenarios so we can compare across the whole suite of them. So I don't really know which one's the most realistic. I also saw a paper come out in Nature a few days ago where someone had looked at using degrowth in these models, or I think these models also have the assumption that economic growth continues the current. And so they've produced some new models which say, no, let's actually flatten that curve. And so I'd love to run those models through this as well. So the work's in review, it's a work in progress. And yeah, I probably do need to expand that out, because I think you're right. Here we've got a very optimistic best case scenario that relies on technologies that may never actually happen. And then we've got a realistic one, which is pretty awful scenario when we look at it. So a bit more detail there will strengthen the work in future, and I'm looking into that right now. But thanks for the question. Krelis, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, James. Thanks for the presentation. It was very, very fascinating, interesting. I'm just asking for maybe a bit of elaboration on your thinking here, because you were mentioning, you know, where should or does, you know, these degrowth economies locally take place, and that we should think about the local, which is about where this all happens. But then again, the challenge is that if you think about extractive economies, they are not local economies. So the place where extraction takes place is not necessarily where most of the economic growth is going to be captured. And even if some of that economic growth is going to be captured in the extractive countries, it's fueled by demand of these overconsumptions overconsumers in the global north, right? So these are the sort of things that degrowth is often thinking about too, and that it's this local and global, and who is responsible. And so I was thinking maybe you could elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, that's a great point. To simplify these things, because I think about it very much from just physical footprint on the ground. And so in a lot of places, our physical footprint has actually become too big, and that needs to retract. And so we've seen that happen in Europe recently with movement towards cities out of the countryside. Our human footprint mapping actually shows that decrease quite well over the last few decades. And so I think for biodiversity conservation, the key question is where that local degrowth or stopping the growth in physical footprint occurs. And obviously that has a link with the overall economic growth and the supply chain to where the demand is. And probably trying to model that and look through that whole chain is interesting. But yeah, it's that local footprint that really matters when it comes to biodiversity conservation. And
thank you.
Of demand in the US and the impact in Papua New Guinea and places. And so you could probably actually look at that supply chain and work out where we need to act on demand to reduce footprint. Any other questions or thoughts?
Could I propose that the first person who asks you the first question repeats his question and you provide again the answer, because it was totally missed and now you are very well audible.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it was thanks. It was a question about the plurality of values and how you included that in your modeling. Yeah, basically that. Thanks.
Do you mind just, in a nutshell, telling me what you mean by plurality of values?
Basically, in my understanding, you used certain conceptualizations of biodiversity, right? You use certain indicators. I'm not sure which indicators, but they refer probably to what in the literature is called inherent value of nature. So nature as separated from humans, but instead in the literature, then there's an elaboration upon different values of nature. So also the instrumental values of nature, such as, for instance, ecosystem services, or then the new categories of relational values. So in my understanding, you didn't include ecosystem services in your mapping. So
no.
I was wondering whether that's correct. And then in general, how you relate to also different ways of seeing nature and therefore different ways of modeling nature in your work.
Yeah, no, so it is really interesting thinking what you're describing there. We focused on the Convention of Biological Diversity's broad goal of stopping species extinction. That was our sort of fundamental aim. And so there are many different relations with nature, but that's the one we chose. And then when you set the goal of stopping extinction of species, it's fairly easy to work out ways to model that and to look at it, because we know they need space to live in. Then there's lots of ways of thinking about how you go about creating that space. Is it a mixed human, nature landscape? Is it a socio-ecological system? Is it a protected area? So I think a lot of that plural thinking comes in at that point too. But in the end, I think a lot of that plural values would be captured in the CBD process, in the UN CBD process, I would hope. It's more representative of the wider conservation community. So no, we didn't explicitly do that for our study. I think we just rely on them having done their job properly on the way to coming up with these broad goals. Does that help clarify that, Marco?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Could I ask a final question, perhaps, Yuri? Do we still have some time? Because Vanessa Lambrechts pointed out that the North Africa and the Middle East is a kind of blind spot in our in monitoring and attention cone. And you analyzed, you did a global analysis and also desegregated the analysis based on nations. Do you actually see some sort of data paucity for this region, James?
Let's think.
Wicked question.
Sure, we know there's biases in the species data that we've analyzed, right? It's been better surveyed in places like Europe and North America than in the tropics. I wouldn't know what that meant for North Africa and the Middle East, though. Yeah, there's definitely biases in the data. I don't know the details of them, I'm afraid.
Now, that I can understand. And is it feasible, do you think, to do some sort of analysis for data intensity or data surveying intensity on a global scale? Because I have seen some examples on this, the sampling representation, the sampling effort. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. And I think some good work already exists with the IUCN species range maps, looking at that sort of bias within the ecological community. It's the type of thing I could go and dig up. I don't have it at my fingertips. With the protected areas, it really comes down to whether nations are, putting that data forward and providing it to UNEP to, collate it all. The wilderness mapping is satellite-based, so the biases in that won't be geographical. There is slight inaccuracy in more arid regions compared to less arid regions when you're using remote sensing data. But with the human footprint that we use to map wilderness, we actually get rid of a lot of that by using bottom-up data on roads, on population. So I think that one probably doesn't have that many biases. But yeah, it would be interesting to look at all those biases.
So if I hear you well, you have basically all you can observe remotely. That is seem to be quite okay. And then the key is what about indeed the species numbers, etc. And for that type of data, we should look into global organizations like the global species list, etc.
Yep, I think a quick Google Scholar search of biases in the IUCN Red List would throw up some interesting studies that might answer your question a lot better than I can.
Yeah,
because it's certainly a big question in conservation circles.
Yeah, I can imagine. Thanks.
No worries. Any final quick question? Doesn't look like it. Well, Kenneth, Yuri, thank you so much for organizing this. And yeah, it's great to be here, everyone. I really appreciate the questions and discussion. So thanks.
Thank you so much, James, for your effort to prepare a presentation for this group. And let's hope something good comes out of it. And I already found it a very stimulating idea that you will also thinking about including a non-growth scenario. And to me, that's an eye-opener too. I'm not an economist, but I'm glad that this symposium perhaps inspires you to do this as well.
Definitely.
Thanks. Bye-bye. So, Yuri, I give the share back to you.
Thank you, Kenneth. And this time we made it in time for a break or a change. So you are much better in keeping track of time, Kenneth. So we have a break until noon, when we we will continue with a contributed workshop. And